September 14th, 1944. Camp Ruston, Louisiana. The mess hall doors swung open, and Corporal Hans Mueller stepped inside expecting thin gruel and black bread. Instead, the smell of roasted meat hit him like a fist. His stomach tightened. For 3 years he'd mocked American soldiers as soft, their dependence on chocolate and coffee a sign of weakness. Now, staring at plates piled with food he hadn't seen since before the war, something inside him cracked. Before we continue this story, if you're enjoying this deep dive into history, hit that like button and subscribe to stay updated with more untold stories from World War II. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community around the world. Your support helps us bring these forgotten moments back to life. Mueller had been captured 2 weeks earlier in France, processed through a holding camp, then shipped across an ocean he'd been taught to despise. The voyage had been long, cramped, filled with bitter jokes about American incompetence. His fellow prisoners laughed about the meals awaiting them. Surely watered-down soup, stale crusts, maybe potato peels if they were lucky. They'd spent years hearing that America was a nation of weaklings, incapable of real sacrifice, dependent on luxuries that would crumble under the weight of true war. But as Mueller sat down at that wooden table, as an American private placed a tray before him loaded with beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread, and real coffee, he understood something that turned his world inside out. This wasn't weakness. This was a strength so vast it could feed even its enemies without flinching. The propaganda had started long before the first shots were fired. In Berlin, in Munich, in every German city and town, the message poured from radios and newspapers like poison into wells. America was soft. Its people were spoiled children playing at war. Its soldiers survived not on discipline and iron will, but on chewing gum, Coca-Cola, and chocolate bars shipped from factories that knew nothing of hardship. The Reich's Ministry of Propaganda painted a picture of American troops unable to function without their creature comforts, dependent on canned fruit and packaged luxuries that would vanish the moment supply lines were cut. In the trenches of North Africa and the frozen forests of Eastern Europe, German soldiers repeated these stories until they became gospel. Around campfires fueled by scraps of wood, they joked about their enemies across the ocean. While they endured black bread that tasted like sawdust, cabbage soup thin enough to see through, and ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns, the Americans supposedly demanded steaks and ice cream. Photographs of smiling G is with cigarettes dangling from their lips, candy bars in their pockets, only confirmed what they'd been taught. To the Wehrmacht, food represented character itself. Hardship forged strength. Abundance bred weakness. Hunger was a crucible that separated the worthy from the soft. The logic was simple, even seductive. If you could endure deprivation, you were strong. If you required comfort, you were doomed. By mocking American rations, German soldiers weren't just ridiculing their enemies' stomachs. They were protecting their own pride, building a wall against a terrifying possibility. What if an army that was both well-fed and well-armed, both comfortable and competent, was unstoppable? What if abundance wasn't weakness at all, but the ultimate expression of power? Those questions were too dangerous to ask. So instead, they laughed. Private Friedrich Weber had laughed louder than most. At 22, he'd served in Italy before his unit was overrun near Monte Cassino. As Allied soldiers marched him and hundreds of others toward transport ships, Weber kept up the mockery. "Wait until we see their food," he muttered to the man beside him. "Probably can't even make a decent loaf of bread without a machine doing it for them." The other prisoners nodded, grim-faced, clinging to the only armor they had left. But beneath the bravado, fear twisted in Weber's gut. Rumors had spread through the holding pens like dysentery. Some swore American camps would starve prisoners into submission. Others claimed they'd be worked to death in coal mines or factories, forgotten by a nation too distant to care. A few whispered darker possibilities, quiet executions, mass graves dug far from witnesses. The voyage across the Atlantic stretched for 2 weeks. Packed into the holds of transport ships, surrounded by the constant groan of metal and the stench of too many men in too small space, the prisoners filled the silence with bitter jokes. "Let's see how these spoiled Americans feed us," they said, loud enough for guards to hear. "Probably rubber steaks and powdered eggs that taste like chalk." But every time the ship's galley sent up the faint smell of cooking, every clang of pots from somewhere above, the jokes rang a little more hollow. None of them believed they'd be treated with kindness. They braced for cruelty, for hunger, for humiliation. They prepared themselves for confirmation of everything they'd been taught about American weakness, disguised as incompetence. Then the ships docked, and everything they thought they knew began to crumble. The first glimpse of America stunned them into silence. Through the narrow portholes, and later, as they were marched down gangplanks onto solid ground, the prisoners saw a nation that bore no resemblance to the propaganda. The harbors stretched endlessly, lined with cranes that towered like steel giants, trucks rolling in orderly lines, warehouses stacked with crates that seemed to multiply before their eyes. Factories rose in the distance, smokestacks billowing into clear skies, the hum of industry vibrating through the very air. There were no starving masses, no chaos, no disorganization. Instead, America pulsed with energy, with order, with a kind of mechanical confidence that made the bombed-out cities of Europe feel like relics from another age. Loaded onto trains, the prisoners pressed their faces against barred windows as the countryside rolled past. Fertile farmlands stretched to the horizon, fields so vast that entire German provinces could have fit inside them. Towns appeared, neat and untouched, houses with painted shutters and lawns that seemed almost obscene in their normalcy. Highways packed with automobiles, more cars than most prisoners had seen in their entire lives. Factories everywhere, their smokestacks exhaling prosperity. Sergeant Otto Becker, a veteran of the Russian front, stared out the window and felt something close to despair. "This is what we're fighting?" he whispered to no one in particular. "This?" The silence among the prisoners grew heavier with every mile. Some tried to resurrect the old jokes, but the words died on their tongues. Others kept their thoughts buried, unwilling to give voice to what their eyes were screaming. The mocking laughter that had once come so easily now felt like a defense mechanism against an unbearable truth. This wasn't weakness. This wasn't softness. This was power on a scale they'd never imagined, and it had barely been scratched by the war that had gutted Europe. Still, they clung to one final expectation. Surely the food would reveal the truth. Surely here, at last, the mask would fall. Camp Ruston sprawled across Louisiana pine forest, row after row of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. As the prisoners marched through the gates, They steeled themselves for the deprivation they'd been anticipating. Thin soup, stale bread, maybe rotten vegetables, the absolute minimum required to keep them alive. Instead, they were led into a mess hall that smelled like a dream they'd forgotten years ago. Long wooden tables stretched in orderly rows. American soldiers moved efficiently between steaming kitchens, carrying trays and pots. And then the food arrived. Hans Mueller stared at his plate and felt his throat tighten. Roasted beef, still warm, juices pooling around the edges. Mashed potatoes with actual butter melting on top. Green beans, not limp and gray, but crisp and seasoned. A thick slice of white bread, soft enough to tear with his fingers. And beside it all, a mug of coffee that smelled real, not the bitter acorn substitute he'd choked down for years. Around him, the mess hall had gone silent. Forks clinked against tin plates. Spoons scraped, but no one spoke. The prisoners ate like men who'd forgotten what food could be, shoveling it down with trembling hands, afraid it might vanish if they looked away. Weber sat across from Mueller, tears streaming down his face as he chewed. "I haven't tasted meat like this since 1940, he whispered. "Not since before everything went to hell." Becker, the hardened sergeant, ate slowly, methodically, his face carved from stone. But his hands shook. For men who had grown used to hunger at the front, who had watched their rations shrink month by month until breakfast was a crust and dinner was watery soup, this was more than shocking. It was impossible. And yet it was real solid, filling their stomachs with a weight they'd almost forgotten. Some prisoners muttered bitter jokes between bites. "We're eating better as captives than our families back home." Others simply stared at their plates in disbelief before scraping up every last morsel. What they had feared as punishment was instead a strange, unsettling generosity. And in that first meal, many realized something they could never say out loud, not yet. America had strength enough to feed even its enemies, not because it had to, but because it could. The routine shattered their remaining certainties. The first meal might have been a fluke, a gesture meant to soften them before the cruelty began. But the second meal came, and the third, and the fourth. Day after day, week after week, the food kept coming in quantities that defied everything they'd been taught about war, sacrifice, and strength. Breakfast was often bread with butter or jam, sometimes scrambled eggs, oatmeal sweetened with sugar, occasionally even bacon when supplies allowed. For men accustomed to starting their mornings with nothing more than crusts of black bread and bitter coffee substitute, it felt surreal, like waking inside someone else's life. Midday brought stews thick with beans, peas, or lentils, often studded with chunks of actual meat. Dinner might feature roast chicken, pork chops, or beef stew with potatoes, gravy, and vegetables that hadn't been boiled into mush. On Sundays and holidays, many camps even served dessert, pies, puddings, canned fruit that tasted almost like luxury, like peacetime. The real revelation, though, was coffee. In Germany, coffee had become a memory, a ghost that haunted kitchen tables. Families stretched tiny rations with roasted barley or acorns, creating a brew so bitter it burned the throat. Children grew up never tasting the real thing. But here, in captivity, steaming mugs of genuine coffee were handed out daily. Mueller would sit in the mess hall, cradling that mug between his palms, inhaling the rich aroma, and feel something close to shame. Back in Hamburg, his mother was probably standing in line for bread rations. his younger sister learning to cook meals from turnips and potato peels. And here he sat, a prisoner of war, drinking coffee that would have cost a month's wages on the black market back home. The irony was crushing. The change in their bodies became obvious within weeks. Soldiers who had marched into captivity hollow-cheeked and gaunt, uniforms hanging off their frames, began to put on weight. Color returned to their faces. Strength returned to their limbs. American medical officers noted the transformation with dry humor in their reports. Prisoner health improving significantly. Many POWs in better physical condition than upon capture. Weight gain averaging 10 to 15 pounds in first month. At Camp Concordia in Kansas, a German doctor working in the prison infirmary wrote in his journal, "We are healthier here than we were serving the fatherland. The irony is almost unbearable. My patients gain weight. Their wounds heal faster. All while our families starve." Tea wasn't gourmet cuisine. The meals were plain, institutional, designed for efficiency and nutrition rather than pleasure. But compared to the hunger that gnawed at Europe, compared to the rations that had shrunk and shrunk until German soldiers were eating bread mixed with sawdust, it was abundance. And in that abundance the prisoners began to realize something that propaganda had never prepared them for. America's strength wasn't measured only in tanks and planes and bombs. It was measured in its ability to feed millions upon millions, soldiers and civilians, allies and enemies, without strain, without sacrifice, without even slowing down. The food stirred something deeper than hunger. It stirred questions that couldn't be answered with jokes or propaganda. At first, many prisoners tried to maintain their ideological armor. In the barracks at night, hardcore Nazis insisted the Americans were trying to fatten them up like livestock before slaughter. Others claimed it was psychological warfare meant to break their will and make them soft. "They want us to forget who we are," one SS officer hissed during an argument that nearly turned violent. "They want us to become like them, weak, dependent, grateful for scraps from the master's table." But with every passing day the routine never changed. The plates remained full. The meals stayed steady. The coffee stayed hot. For some prisoners, the contrast with home became unbearable. Letters arrived from Germany painted in shades of gray and hunger. Weber's wife wrote about standing in line for 4 hours to buy 2 pounds of potatoes. Muller's mother described Christmas dinner, turnip soup, and a single piece of bread shared among 5 people. Becker's sister wrote that his nephew had never tasted chocolate, had never seen a banana, asked if oranges were real, or just something from fairy tales. These letters were folded and refolded until the paper wore thin, read under dim barrack lights until the words were memorized. And then the prisoners would walk into the mess hall, smell fresh bread and roasted meat, pour themselves real coffee, and feel a shame so profound it had no name. Some stopped writing about food altogether, terrified their families would resent them. Others wrote lies, claiming they were barely fed, that conditions were harsh, anything to avoid admitting the truth. A few wrote honestly, and their letters were never answered again. Arguments broke out in the barracks, sometimes escalating into fistfights. The ideological true believers insisted American abundance was a sign of moral decay, that luxury rotted the soul, that Germany's suffering proved its spiritual superiority. But others, quietly at first, and then more boldly, began to push back. "What kind of nation," Weber asked one night, his voice carrying through the silent barrack, "can feed millions of its own people, fight a war on 2 continents, arm half of Europe, and still set our tables with meat and coffee every single day? The silence that followed was answer enough. The laughter that had filled the transport ships, the mocking jokes about American softness, were gone now. In their place was something more complicated, more painful. Reluctant admiration, quiet doubt, and for some the first cracks in a worldview built on lies. Our meal became less about filling stomachs and more about confronting reality. To mock America now seemed foolish, a child's tantrum against forces he couldn't comprehend. To admire America was dangerous, a betrayal of everything they'd fought for. And yet, with every bite, admiration grew whether they wanted it to or not. The contrast with home became impossible to ignore. By late 1944, Germany was starving. The letters told the story in brutal detail, but the prisoners didn't need letters to know the truth. They'd lived it before capture. Ration cards that provided less and less each month. Lines that stretched around city blocks for bread or potatoes. Meat that had become a memory. Butter and sugar, once staples, now luxuries reserved for the elite. Coffee, real coffee, had vanished entirely, replaced by roasted barley or chicory root that tasted like dirt. Mueller kept his wife's letters in a small tin box under his bunk. She wrote about their daughter, 9 years old, who cried from hunger pains at night. She described trading her wedding ring for 2 loaves of bread. She mentioned almost casually that rats had become a viable source of protein in some neighborhoods. "Do not worry about us," she wrote in careful script. "We endure. We are German. We are strong." But between the lines, Mueller could read the truth. They were dying slowly, not from bombs or bullets, but from the simple, grinding absence of enough food. At Camp Alva in Oklahoma, prisoner Klaus Hartmann received a letter from his brother on the Eastern Front. "We are eating grass soup and calling it stew," it said. "Men were executed for stealing food. I no longer know what victory means." Hartmann read it, then entered a mess hall serving pork chops, applesauce, corn, and fresh bread. He wept. The irony crushed prisoners. They ate better than their families at home. Some felt shame. Others felt anger. They felt the realization they had been lied to. These meals were evidence. Germany starved while America overflowed. The Reich demanded sacrifice and promised victory that never came. America fought a global war and still fed its enemies. Food became a lesson in power. The prisoners mocked American abundance as weakness, believing hardship created strength. But every hot meal proved otherwise. Abundance was not softness. It was capacity. The Americans did not need cruelty. Their confidence was devastating. Debates filled the barracks. Becker, a Stalingrad veteran, ended them simply, "Real strength is having so much you can give it away." The words lingered. Some prisoners returned to a ruined Germany and spoke of full mess halls. Others stayed in America, married, worked, and built new lives. Hans Mueller was one who stayed. He later wrote, "I learned hunger isn't strength. Here, even prisoners eat." On September 14, 1944, he understood Germany had already lost not to weapons, but to abundance.